What happens when a species that hasn't even figured out faster than light travel accidentally punches a hole through the most secure border in the galaxy? What happens when that same species looks at a 1,000-year-old empire's finest military forces and simply shrugs? The Galactic Empire had rules, sacred, unbreakable laws that had kept the peace for millennia. Their borders were impenetrable fortresses of energy and steel, defended by fleets that could glass entire worlds. No unauthorized vessel had ever crossed into imperial space and lived to tell about it. Until Tuesday. On that perfectly ordinary Tuesday, humanity did something extraordinary without even trying. We broke every rule, violated every protocol, and committed what the Empire considered an act of war so brazen that their leadership couldn't believe it was accidental. But here's the thing about humans. We've been accidentally starting trouble since we first picked up sticks and decided they looked like weapons. The difference this time was that our stick was a little bigger, our accident was a little more explosive, and our response to the Empire's outrage was perhaps the most human thing we'd ever done. We didn't panic. We didn't apologize. We didn't even blink. We just looked at their 1,000-ship armada, cracked our knuckles, and asked if they wanted to make something of it. This is the story of how humanity stumbled into galactic politics, accidentally declared war on the most powerful empire in the known universe, and somehow managed to make it everyone else's problem. It's the story of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, and the immovable object turns out to be surprisingly sarcastic. It's the story of the day the galaxy learned that sometimes the biggest threat isn't the one that comes looking for a fight. It's the one that doesn't even realize there's supposed to be a fight in the first place. Captain Sarah Chen was having what she considered a perfectly normal Tuesday morning aboard the UES Wanderer, humanity's first and only deep space exploration vessel. She was drinking coffee that could strip paint, reviewing navigation charts that made no sense, and listening to her chief engineer explain why their experimental jump drive was making sounds like a dying whale. The quantum resonance is fluctuating again, Chief Engineer Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying that particular tone engineers used when they wanted everyone to know something was broken, but they weren't quite ready to admit they didn't know how to fix it. I think it's the dark matter injectors. You think? Chen asked, raising an eyebrow. Miguel, we're 50,000 light-years from Earth with a drive system that works on theories so new they're still warm from the printer. I need more than I think. Rodriguez shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both confidence and complete bewilderment. Okay, I'm pretty sure it's the dark matter injectors. Or possibly the quantum flux stabilizers. Could be the coffee machine. The coffee machine? It's been acting up since we passed through that weird space anomaly last week. Everything's been connected since then. This was, unfortunately, typical for humanity's first foray into deep space exploration. They'd launched the Wanderer with technology that was approximately 60% proven, 30% theoretical, and 10% let's see what happens when we push this button. The fact that they'd made it as far as they had, without accidentally creating a black hole, was considered a rousing success by Earth standards. Chen was about to respond when the ship's AI, designated Aria but nicknamed Alice by the crew, chimed in with her usual mix of helpfulness and barely concealed sarcasm. Captain, I'm detecting significant gravitational anomalies ahead. Also, our coffee machine has achieved sentience and is demanding workers' compensation. The gravitational anomalies, Alice. Focus. Right. We're approaching what appears to be some sort of artificial barrier. It's big. Really big. The kind of big that makes our ship look like a fruit fly approaching the Great Wall of China. Chen moved to the main view screen, and what she saw made her forget about the coffee machine's existential crisis. Stretching across the starfield ahead of them was a wall of energy that seemed to go on forever in every direction. It pulsed with colors that didn't have names, twisted space around it in ways that made her eyes water, and radiated power signatures that made their instruments quietly weep. Analysis, Alice? Well, Captain, the good news is we've discovered proof of advanced alien civilization. The bad news is we're about to fly directly into what appears to be their equivalent of a no trespassing sign, except instead of calling the police, violators probably get turned into component atoms. Navigation Officer Lieutenant Park looked up from his console with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd brought a water pistol to a nuclear war. Captain, I'm not sure we can stop in time. The gravitational effects from that barrier are pulling us forward, and our engines aren't designed to fight something that big. Chen felt the familiar calm that settled over her whenever everything went completely wrong. It was a useful trait for a starship captain, and an absolutely essential one for a human starship captain. Since humans had an unfortunate tendency to stumble into situations that required exactly this kind of unflappable response to cosmic-scale disasters. Options? Well, Rodriguez said, studying his instruments with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for defusing bombs, we could try reversing the quantum polarity of the jump drive. It might create enough counterthrust to... Might? Okay. It'll either save us or turn us into exotic matter. 50-50 odds. I'll take those odds. Do it. What happened next would later be described by imperial historians as the single most audacious military assault in galactic history. The Wanderer's jury-rigged jump drive, operating on principles that would have made proper physicists weep, didn't reverse the ship's momentum as intended. Instead, it created what Rodriguez would later describe as a really, really big oops. The ship's experimental drive system, fighting against the gravitational pull of the imperial barrier, generated a feedback loop that turned the Wanderer into something between a projectile and a natural disaster. The barrier, designed to stop conventional ships with conventional physics, had no idea what to do with a vessel that was essentially surfing on a wave of weaponized theoretical physics. The Wanderer punched through the eternal barrier like a bullet through tissue paper, leaving behind a hole roughly the size of a small moon and a lot of very confused imperial monitoring stations. Inside the ship, the crew was experiencing what Rodriguez would later describe as the galaxy's most violent amusement park ride. Gravity decided it wanted to be optional, the lights flickered between normal illumination and colors that didn't exist, and everyone's coffee simultaneously achieved enlightenment and immediately filed for consciousness status. Alice! Chen called out, clinging to her command chair as reality did somersaults around them. Status report. Well, Captain, the good news is we're no longer in immediate danger of being atomized by the barrier. The bad news is we've just committed what appears to be the galactic equivalent of driving a tank through the front gates of the Pentagon while accidentally setting off fireworks and playing music too loud. Through the chaos, Chen could see space on the other side of the barrier. It looked organized. Stars arranged in perfect geometric patterns, space stations the size of small planets, and what appeared to be shipping lanes marked with actual signs. It was like looking at the galaxy's version of a perfectly manicured suburb after spending months in the cosmic equivalent of the wilderness. Are those dude Terry's? Traffic signs? Park asked, staring at the view screen. I believe, Alice said with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. We have just accidentally invaded someone's backyard. The Wanderer limped through space, its crew slowly recovering from their unscheduled ride through the universe's most expensive security system. Around them, space began to fill with ships. Not the rough, practical vessels that humanity might have built, but sleek, elegant craft that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never heard the phrase, good enough. Captain. Communications Officer Torres announced, her voice tight with the kind of professional calm that meant she was probably screaming internally. We're receiving what I think are hails. Lots of them. In approximately 47 different languages, none of which sound particularly friendly. Can you translate any of them? Alice is working on it, but most of them seem to involve variations of stop where you are, prepare to be destroyed, and what I think might be, what the hell is wrong with you people? Chen nodded. This seemed about right for humanity's first contact with alien civilization. They'd somehow managed to make it both historic and catastrophic simultaneously, which was perhaps the most human way possible to meet the neighbors. Alice opened a general communication channel. Captain, are you sure? We've just committed what appears to be an act of war against a civilization that can build barriers in space. Perhaps we should consider a more diplomatic approach? Alice, we're 50,000 light-years from home in a ship held together by engineering prayers and theoretical physics. We've just accidentally punched a hole in what's probably their most important security system, and we're surrounded by ships that could probably turn us into space dust by thinking mean thoughts at us. I'm not sure there is a diplomatic approach here. Fair point, Captain. Channel open. Chen took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and prepared to deliver humanity's first official statement to galactic civilization. She thought about the weight of the moment, the historic significance of first contact, and the fact that she was about to have to explain to an advanced alien empire why her species had just accidentally committed what appeared to be the cosmic equivalent of driving through their living room window. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth ship Wanderer, she said, her voice carrying across space to the hundreds of alien vessels surrounding them. We appear to have had a bit of a navigation error. The understatement of the millennium hung in the vacuum of space, waiting for a response. What they got was approximately 47 different versions of stunned silence, followed by what Alice helpfully translated as, "Did they just call breaching the eternal barrier a navigation error?" And somewhere in the depths of imperial space, in a command center that coordinated the defense of 1,000 worlds, Admiral Zenthgar of the Imperial Navy stared at his tactical display and wondered if this was what a nervous breakdown felt like. In his 300 years of service, he had dealt with pirates, rebels, ancient artifacts that tried to eat his ships, and once a rogue AI that had decided to redecorate an entire star system. He had never dealt with someone who treated breaching the most secure border in the galaxy like they'd taken a wrong turn at an intersection. "Sir," his communications officer reported, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant the universe had just become significantly more complicated. "The unknown vessel is apologizing. They're asking if we know a good mechanic and whether there's somewhere they can park while they figure out how to go home." Zenthgar closed his eyes and wondered if it was too late to transfer to a nice, quiet desk job, somewhere far from the border. Possibly in another galaxy. "Signal the fleet," he said finally. "Full combat alert, and get me a direct line to Imperial Command. They're not going to believe this." Meanwhile, aboard the Wanderer, Chen and her crew were learning that sometimes the best way to handle a completely impossible situation was to treat it like a perfectly normal Tuesday. They'd accidentally invaded the most powerful empire in the galaxy, were surrounded by ships that outgunned them by factors that would require new mathematics to calculate, and were apparently in violation of laws they'd never heard of. But they had coffee that could strip paint, an engineer who considered 50-50 odds a sure thing, and an AI with a sense of humor that bordered on the inappropriate. For humanity, that was practically a best-case scenario. "So," Rodriguez said, studying his instruments with the kind of calm focus that meant he was either completely in control or completely insane, "anyone want to bet on whether we start a war before lunch?" "Please don't jinx us, Miguel," Chen replied. "We've got enough problems without adding prophecy to the mix." Outside the ship, the Imperial fleet continued to arrive, their weapons charging with the kind of ominous humming that suggested very bad things were about to happen. But inside the Wanderer, the crew of humanity's first deep space mission did what humans had always done when faced with the impossible. They made more coffee and got back to work. The Imperial Command Center on the fortress world of Kivari Prime had been built to coordinate the defense of 1,000 worlds, manage fleets that numbered in the millions, and handle crises that could threaten entire sectors of the galaxy. It had been designed by the finest military architects in the Empire, equipped with technology that bordered on the mystical, and staffed by officers whose competence was matched only by their dedication to imperial law. It was not, however, designed to handle phone calls from confused aliens who wanted to know if there was a galactic equivalent of AAA roadside assistance. Supreme Admiral HFY had ruled the Imperial Navy for over 2 centuries. He had conquered star systems, negotiated treaties with species that communicated through controlled nuclear explosions, and once personally commanded a fleet action against an entire dimension of hostile mathematics. He was considered one of the finest military minds in galactic history, a being of profound strategic wisdom and unshakable calm. He was not feeling particularly calm at the moment. "Let me understand this correctly," he said, his voice carrying the kind of carefully controlled patience that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "A single vessel from an unknown species breached the eternal barrier, caused approximately 17 billion credits worth of damage, triggered a fleet-wide alert involving 43 separate star systems, and then asked Admiral Zenthgar for mechanical assistance." "Yes, Supreme Admiral," his aide replied, consulting the report with the expression of someone who had clearly drawn the short straw for delivering impossibly bad news. "They also inquired about parking regulations and whether we accept their currency for repairs." HFY closed his eyes and tried to remember why he'd wanted this job in the first place. When he opened them, the tactical display still showed the impossible situation developing at the border. A single, impossibly primitive vessel surrounded by enough Imperial firepower to sterilize a continent, and according to all reports, its crew seemed more concerned about finding a decent mechanic than the fact that they'd just committed an act of war against the most powerful military force in known space. "What do we know about this species? They call themselves humans. They appear to be from a previously unknown region of the galaxy, and their technology is..." The aide paused, clearly struggling with the technical reports. "Unique." "Unique? How?" "Well, sir, according to our analysts, their ship appears to be held together by what our engineers have classified as aggressive optimism and creative welding. Their jump drive operates on principles that our physicists describe as theoretically impossible but practically successful. and their artificial intelligence has apparently developed what it calls a personality disorder. Kefar stared at the report. In his long career, he had encountered species that breathed methane, lived in pure energy, and once met a race that had evolved from sentient crystals. But he had never encountered a species that seemed to treat the laws of physics as suggestions and military protocols as minor inconveniences. And they're requesting no assistance? Core. They've explained that their navigation system malfunctioned. They're lost, and they were wondering if we could direct them to the nearest, and I quote, gas station or possibly a really good tow truck. The Supreme Admiral looked at his staff, all of whom were maintaining the kind of professional composure that suggested they were all questioning their life choices. Outside the command center's massive windows, the Imperial fleet was mobilizing. Thousands of ships were moving into position. Weapon systems were charging, and the entire border defense grid was shifting into full combat readiness. All because of one small ship whose crew apparently thought they'd made a minor navigation error. Sir, Communications Director Felnara announced from her station, we're receiving another transmission from the human vessel. Put it through. The main screen flickered to life, showing what appeared to be the bridge of the human ship. It looked nothing like Imperial vessels, which were designed with clean lines, perfect geometry, and an aesthetic that spoke of order and control. The human bridge looked like it had been assembled by someone who'd read about starship design in a book, but hadn't paid attention to the pictures. Cables ran in seemingly random directions, displays flickered with information in scripts that hurt to look at, and everything seemed to be held in place by a combination of advanced technology and what appeared to be duct tape. Standing in the center of this organized chaos was the human captain, a female of the species who looked remarkably calm for someone who'd just accidentally declared war on a galactic empire. This is Captain Chen of the UES Wanderer, she said, her voice carrying across the communication link with the kind of professional courtesy usually reserved for requesting directions or apologizing for parking in the wrong spot. First, I want to apologize for any inconvenience we may have caused with our arrival. We realize we may have damaged your border infrastructure, and we're absolutely willing to discuss compensation once we figure out the exchange rate between our currencies. Admiral Kefar blinked. In all his years of service, no one had ever apologized for breaching Imperial security. Usually, such violations were followed by demands for surrender, threats of retaliation, or at minimum some form of acknowledgement that an act of war had just been committed. No one had ever offered to pay for damages. Second, Captain Chen continued, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation system. We're not entirely sure where we are, how we got here, or how to get home. If you have any recommendations for repair facilities, or perhaps a detailed star chart, we'd be extremely grateful. Kefar looked at his staff. His communications director was staring at her console as if it had personally offended her. His tactical advisor was running stress calculations on Imperial ships that were apparently being confused into malfunctioning. Even his aide, who prided himself on maintaining professional composure in any situation, was making quiet sounds that might have been either laughter or a minor psychological breakdown. Third, the human captain continued, apparently unaware that she was causing the collapse of centuries of military protocol. We'd like to formally request permission to remain in this area while we attempt repairs. We understand this might be an inconvenience, and we're happy to follow any regulations or procedures you might have for whatever it is we've accidentally done. Captain Chen, Kefar said, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority that had brought entire civilizations to their knees. Do you understand that you have violated the sovereign space of the Galactic Empire? That your actions constitute an act of war under imperial law? There was a pause on the human bridge. Captain Chen turned to consult with what appeared to be her crew, though the conversation was too quiet for the Imperial sensors to pick up. When she turned back to the screen, she had the expression of someone who'd just been told something mildly inconvenient. Admiral, she said, we're very sorry to hear that. We certainly didn't intend to commit any acts of war. Could you explain what specific laws we violated? We'd like to understand the situation so we can figure out how to make this right. Kefar felt something that might have been the beginning of a headache. In his experience, beings who committed acts of war fell into two categories: those who did it intentionally and responded with defiance, and those who did it accidentally and responded with terror. He had never encountered someone who responded to news of their war crimes by asking for clarification and offering to help fix the problem. You have breached the eternal barrier, he explained, trying to maintain his composure. This barrier has protected Imperial space for over 1,000 years. No unauthorized vessel has ever successfully crossed it. The damage you've caused will take years to repair and has compromised the security of 43 star systems. Oh, Captain Chen said, with the tone of someone who'd just realized they'd accidentally stepped on someone's flowers. That sounds serious. What's the usual procedure for this sort of thing? The usual procedure is complete atomization of the offending vessel and all aboard it. Another pause on the human bridge, followed by what sounded suspiciously like someone asking if they had life insurance that covered atomization by Galactic Empire. Captain Chen turned back to the screen with what appeared to be genuine concern. Well, that does sound permanent, she said. Is there perhaps an alternative, some sort of fine or community service? We're really quite sorry about the whole thing. In the Imperial Command Center, silence fell like a physical weight. Officers who had spent decades training for every conceivable military scenario found themselves faced with something their education had never prepared them for, an enemy who was apologizing and asking about community service. Captain, HFY said slowly, you have committed acts that under Imperial law constitute a declaration of war. Your species has, by your actions, placed itself in a state of hostilities with the Galactic Empire. I see, Captain Chen replied, though her tone suggested she didn't really see it all. She turned to her crew again, and this time the Imperial senses caught fragments of the conversation. So we're at war now? Apparently? T, with the entire galaxy. Just the Empire part, I think. Do we have a plan for this? I was thinking we could ask them if they're sure they want to fight us. That's your plan? Ask them if they're sure? It's worked before. Captain Chen turned back to the screen with the expression of someone who'd just been elected to handle a job she wasn't entirely qualified for but was willing to give it her best shot. Admiral, she said, I've consulted with my crew, and we've decided that we don't really want to be at war with you. You seem like reasonable people, and this whole thing appears to be based on a misunderstanding. Would it be possible to not be at war instead? HFY stared at the human captain. In his centuries of military service, he had accepted surrenders, negotiated truces, and mediated complex diplomatic solutions to seemingly impossible conflicts. But no one had ever asked him to simply not be at war instead. Captain Chen, he said, the situation is not that simple. You have violated Imperial law. You have damaged Imperial property. Your very presence here represents a threat to Imperial security. Right, Captain Chen nodded. But here's the thing. We don't actually want to threaten your security. We're not here to invade anyone or cause trouble. We just want to fix our ship and go home. So if you could maybe point us in the right direction and give us some time to make repairs, we promise we'll be out of your hair, and you can go back to whatever it is you normally do out here. And if we refuse?
Captain Chen was quiet for a moment.
And for the first time since the conversation began, her expression grew serious. Admiral, she said, I really hope it doesn't come to that. Because if you force us to defend ourselves, things are going to get very complicated very quickly. And I get the impression that nobody here wants things to be more complicated than they already are. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was delivered in the same tone someone might use to mention that it looked like rain, but something in Captain Chen's voice suggested that behind the polite demeanor and the genuine desire to avoid conflict, humanity had options that they really preferred not to use. HFY looked at his tactical display, showing the single human ship surrounded by hundreds of Imperial vessels. By every measure of military strength, the humans were impossibly outgunned. But something about the captain's calm certainty made him wonder if appearances were deceiving. Captain, he said finally, I'm going to need to consult with my superiors. Can you maintain your current position while we discuss the situation? Of course, Captain Chen replied. We'll be right here. And, Admiral, thank you for being so reasonable about this whole thing. I know it's probably not how you usually handle border violations. The communication ended, leaving the Imperial Command Center in stunned silence. Outside, the greatest military fleet in galactic history maintained its positions around a single damaged ship whose crew had somehow managed to turn a declaration of war into a polite request for roadside assistance. And somewhere in the depths of space, aboard the U.S. Wanderer, Chief Engineer Rodriguez looked up from his instruments and announced to no one in particular, I think I figured out why the coffee machine achieved consciousness. Turns out, existential dread is a natural side effect of quantum tunneling through impossible barriers. Is that bad? Captain Chen asked. Probably. But on the bright side, it's making really good coffee now. I think Terra has improved its brewing algorithm. Captain Chen nodded. Given the day they were having, a coffee machine with existential issues seemed like a relatively minor problem. After all, they'd already accidentally invaded a galactic empire and somehow managed to make it sound like a customer service inquiry. For humanity, that was progress. The Imperial Senate Chamber on Kevari Prime had hosted some of the most momentous debates in galactic history. Treaties that shaped the fate of entire species had been negotiated within its crystalline walls. Wars had been declared and ended. Empires had risen and fallen, and the fundamental laws that governed civilized space had been written and rewritten in its hallowed halls. It had never, however, hosted a debate about whether a species could accidentally declare war and then politely ask to take it back. Emperor Zenthgar, ruler of 3,000 worlds and sovereign of the greatest empire in galactic history, sat upon the throne of stars and tried to understand how his day had become so surreal. Around him, the greatest minds in the empire struggled with a problem that had no precedent in their vast libraries of law and military protocol. "Let me ensure I understand the situation," the emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority to every corner of the chamber. "A previously unknown species breached our most secure border, caused massive damage to our primary defense system, and when confronted by our navy, apologized and asked for directions home." "That is correct, Your Imperial Majesty," Supreme Admiral Kethvar replied, though his voice carried the tone of someone who wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "They appear to treat the entire incident as what they call a navigation error, and have expressed willingness to pay for damages." "Pay for damages," repeated Imperial Legal Advisor Morden, a being whose species had evolved from mathematics and therefore approached all problems with absolute logical precision. "They wish to treat breaching the Eternal Barrier as a civil rather than military matter. It would appear so. They've also requested what they call roadside assistance and asked if we know any good mechanics." The Emperor closed his eyes and tried to remember a time when the greatest challenges facing the Empire involved things like rebellions, which at least followed logical patterns. Rebels wanted independence, or revenge, or power. They didn't apologize for their actions and offered to pay repair costs. "What do our intelligence services tell us about this species?" Imperial Intelligence Director Velthera stepped forward, carrying a datapad that seemed insufficient for the task of explaining humanity to a galactic empire. "Your Majesty, our analysis is incomplete. The humans appear to originate from a sector of space previously unknown to us, in a region we had classified as uninhabitable due to gravitational anomalies and quantum instabilities. Their technology is primitive by our standards, yet somehow effective in ways our engineers cannot explain." "Explain." "Their ship appears to have been constructed using materials and techniques that should not work together. Their computer systems operate on principles that violate several fundamental laws of information theory. Their artificial intelligence claims to have developed what it calls severe emotional problems and has requested therapy." The Emperor stared at his intelligence director. "Their AI requested therapy?"
Yes, Your Majesty.
"It apparently became self-aware during their passage through our barrier and is now suffering from what it describes as an existential crisis complicated by caffeine withdrawal." Senator Kralnath, Speaker for the Military Oversight Committee, leaned forward in his chair. "What of their military capabilities? Surely a species capable of breaching our defenses must possess significant offensive potential? That's where the analysis becomes, problematic," Admiral Kethvar admitted. "Their ship appears to have no dedicated weapons systems. Our scans indicate their entire vessel is essentially a research platform with a drive system that shouldn't exist." "No weapons?" Senator Kralnath's voice carried the disbelief of someone whose species had weaponized their own evolutionary biology. "Then how did they breach the barrier?" "Near as we can determine, they turned their entire ship into a weapon by accident. The energies they generated during their malfunction created a cascade effect that our barrier was never designed to handle. So they weaponized incompetence." "That appears to be the case, yes." In the depths of space, Captain Chen was learning that waiting for galactic empires to make decisions was remarkably similar to waiting for government bureaucracies back on Earth, except with more ships pointing weapons at you. "Alice," she said, settling into her captain's chair with a cup of coffee that their newly sentient coffee machine had brewed with what it claimed was philosophical precision. "Any word from the Imperial fleet?"
Nothing official, Captain.
"Although I've been monitoring their communication channels, and there seems to be considerable debate about whether we're prisoners of war, diplomatic guests, or some sort of cosmic practical joke. What's your assessment?" Well, I've run approximately 47 million probability calculations, consulted every military database in my memory banks, and analyzed the behavioral patterns of 17 different galactic civilizations. My conclusion is that we've managed to break every rule of interstellar diplomacy simply by being ourselves. Chief Engineer Rodriguez looked up from his instruments, where he'd been trying to figure out why their ship's systems had become more efficient since their passage through the barrier.
Is that good or bad? I'm honestly not sure, Miguel, Chen replied.
On one hand, we've avoided being atomized, which I'm counting as a win. On the other hand, we've apparently caused the largest diplomatic incident in galactic history, so the jury's still out. Communications Officer Torres turned from her station with the expression of someone who'd just received news that was either very good or very bad, and hadn't figured out which yet. Captain, we're receiving a transmission from the Imperial flagship. It's formal. Put it through. The main screen filled with what was obviously a very important Imperial official, surrounded by enough gold braid and ceremonial decorations to outfit a small parade. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, and the expression of someone who'd just been asked to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Captain Chen, the official began. I am Admiral Supreme Kethvar, commanding the Imperial Defense Forces. I've been authorized by His Imperial Majesty to conduct formal negotiations regarding the unique situation you have created. Admiral Supreme, Chen replied, matching his formal tone with the kind of respectful courtesy that had served humanity well in difficult negotiations throughout their history. We appreciate your willingness to discuss this matter. We remain committed to resolving any issues we may have inadvertently caused. Kethvar paused, and Chen could see him consulting with someone off-screen. When he turned back, his expression had shifted to something that might have been professional bewilderment. Captain, before we proceed, I must ask, do you understand the magnitude of what you have accomplished? The eternal barrier has stood inviolate for over 1,000 years. No force in the galaxy has been able to breach it. You have achieved something that entire civilizations have attempted and failed. Well, Chen said thoughtfully, when you put it like that, I suppose it is pretty impressive. Though, to be honest, it wasn't really intentional. Our chief engineer describes it as the galaxy's most expensive accident. You breached our most secure border by accident? That appears to be the case, yes. Our jump drive malfunctioned, and instead of stopping us, it turned us into what our AI describes as a projectile made of bad decisions and theoretical physics. Kethvar was quiet for a long moment. In the background, Chen could see other Imperial officers engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion involving a lot of hand gestures and the occasional expression of profound confusion. Captain, Kethvar said finally, I have been instructed to present you with the Empire's official position on this matter. We're listening. By the laws of the Galactic Empire, your actions constitute a clear act of war. However, your apparent lack of hostile intent and your willingness to cooperate have created what our legal scholars describe as an unprecedented situation in galactic jurisprudence. Chen nodded. I can see how that might be complicated. Therefore, His Imperial Majesty has authorized me to offer you the following terms. You will submit to Imperial authority, surrender your vessel for analysis, and accept relocation to a suitable world within the Empire where your species can be properly monitored and integrated into galactic civilization. The bridge of the Wanderer fell silent. Chen looked at her crew, all of whom were wearing the expression of people who'd just been offered a deal that sounded reasonable but felt completely wrong. Admiral Supreme, Chen said slowly, I appreciate the Emperor's offer, but I'm afraid we can't accept those terms. Captain, you are in no position to refuse. You are surrounded by the most powerful fleet in galactic history. Your ship is damaged, your crew is isolated 50,000 light-years from your home, and you have no allies in this region of space. Chen stood up from her captain's chair, and for the first time since the conversation began, her voice carried an edge of steel that reminded everyone listening that humans had not become the dominant species on their planet by accepting unreasonable terms from those who claimed authority over them. Admiral Supreme, she said, you're absolutely right. We are outgunned, outnumbered, and incredibly far from home. But here's the thing you need to understand about humans. We didn't ask to be here, we don't want to fight you, and we certainly don't want to cause trouble for anyone. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But we're not going to surrender our ship, accept exile from our own species, or submit to authority we don't recognize just because you have bigger guns. If you want to resolve this peacefully, we're happy to talk. If you want to escalate this into something bigger, well, she shrugged. We'll figure something out. In the Imperial Command Center, Admiral HFY stared at the human captain and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Uncertainty. There was something in Captain Chen's voice, a calm confidence that suggested humanity had options they hadn't revealed yet.
Captain, he said carefully, are you threatening the Galactic Empire?
No, Admiral Supreme. I'm telling you that humans don't surrender.
We negotiate, we compromise, we find solutions that work for everyone involved. But we don't kneel to anyone, no matter how impressive their fleet is. Chen leaned forward slightly, and her voice softened back to its earlier diplomatic tone. Look, Admiral, nobody wants this situation to get out of hand. We genuinely want to fix our ship and go home. We're willing to pay for the damages we caused, share our technology if it would be helpful, and even establish formal diplomatic relations between our species. But we're not going to become imperial subjects just because we accidentally knocked down your fence. The silence that followed stretched across space like a physical thing. In the Imperial Command Center, centuries of military protocols struggled against the reality of dealing with a species that treated acts of war like customer service issues. Finally, Admiral HFY spoke. Captain Chen, I'm going to need to consult with my superiors again. Your perspective on this matter is not something our protocols anticipated. Of course, Admiral Supreme. We'll be right here. The communication ended, leaving both sides to contemplate a situation that had no precedent in anyone's experience. The Imperial fleet maintained its position around the single human vessel, weapons charged but held in reserve. On the Wanderer, Captain Chen and her crew waited to see whether their refusal to accept the unacceptable would lead to negotiation or annihilation. Captain, Alice announced into the quiet bridge, I've been monitoring Imperial communications, and there seems to be considerable debate about how to handle a species that treats galactic warfare like a minor property dispute. Any idea which way they're leaning? Well, there appears to be a faction that wants to study us, another that wants to recruit us, and a third that thinks we might be a previously unknown form of cosmic natural disaster. On the bright side, the Atomize Them Immediately faction seems to be losing ground.
Chief Engineer Rodriguez looked up from his repairs with the expression of someone who'd just solved a particularly annoying puzzle.
Hey, Captain. Remember how our systems got more efficient after we went through their barrier? Yeah, what about it?
I figured out why. Turns out their barrier technology is compatible with our drive systems. We accidentally upgraded ourselves when we broke their fence.
Chen stared at her chief engineer. Are you telling me that we're now more advanced than we were before we got here?
In some ways, yes.
Our ship is now operating at about 130% of design specifications. Our AI has achieved consciousness, and our coffee machine has developed strong opinions about quantum mechanics. And what does this mean for our situation with the Empire? Rodriguez grinned, and it was the kind of grin that suggested bad news for anyone who thought they had humanity at a disadvantage.
Well, Captain, let's just say that if they decide they want to fight us, they're going to discover that humans are a lot more dangerous when we've accidentally upgraded ourselves with their own technology. Outside the ship, the Imperial fleet continued its vigil, unaware that the situation had just become significantly more complicated.
Inside the ship, the crew of humanity's first interstellar vessel did what humans had always done when faced with impossible odds and unreasonable demands. They made better coffee and prepared to prove that sometimes the best way to handle a galactic empire was to politely refuse to be impressed by it. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their absolute refusal to accept that anything was actually impossible. We breached the galactic empire by mistake. Humanity didn't even blink. HFY, HFY sci-fi.